Hi, I'm Steve Price. Today I'm going to read from Bill Byson's memoir, The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid. The book is about growing up in Middle America in the 1950s. Bill Byson was born in 1951, just 2 years before I was born, so I can share a lot of the occurrences and references he makes in this book. There was a slight difference between our growing up. He grew up in Iowa, America's heartland. I grew up in Las Vegas, America's Sin City. So not exactly the same, but could relate to a lot. So The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid by Bill Byson. I can't imagine there has ever been a more gratifying time or place to be alive than in America in the 1950s. No country had ever known such prosperity. When the war ended, the United States had $26 billion worth of factories that hadn't existed before the war, $140 billion in savings and war bonds just waiting to be spent, no bomb damage, and practically no competition. All the American companies had to do was stop making tanks and battleships and start making Buicks and Frigidaires. And boy, they did. By 1951, when I came sliding down the chute, almost 90% of American families had refrigerators, and nearly 3/4 had washing machines, telephones, vacuum cleaners, and gas or electric stoves, things that most of the rest of the world could still only fantasize about. Americans owned 80% of the world's electrical goods, controlled 2/3 of the world's productive capacity, produced more than 40% of its electricity, 60% of its oil, and 66% of its steel. The 5% of people on Earth who were Americans had more wealth than the other 95% combined. Remarkably, almost all this wealth was American-made. Of the 7 million new cars sold in America in 1954, for instance, 99.93% were made in America by Americans. We were the richest country in the world without needing the rest of the world. No wonder people were so happy. Suddenly they were able to have things they had never dreamed of having, and they couldn't believe their luck. There was, too, a wonderful simplicity of desire. It was the last time that people would be thrilled to own a toaster or a waffle iron. If you bought a major appliance, you invited the neighbors around to have a look at it. When I was about 4, my parents bought an Amana Stormore refrigerator, and for at least 6 months it was like an honored guest in our kitchen. I'm sure they would have drawn it up to the table at dinner if it hadn't been so heavy. When visitors dropped by unexpectedly, my mother would say, "Oh, Mary, is there any iced tea in the Amana?" Then to the guest, he'd add significantly, "There usually is. It's a Stormore." "Oh, a Stormore," the male visitor would say, and elevate his eyebrows in the manner of someone who appreciates quality cooling. We thought about getting a Stormore ourselves, but in the end, we went for a Philco SureCool. Alice loved the Easy Glide vegetable drawer, and you could get a full quart of ice cream in the freezer box. That was a big selling point for Wendell Jr., as you can imagine. They'd all have a good laugh at that and then sit around drinking iced tea and talking appliances for an hour or so. No human beings had ever been quite this happy before. People looked forward to the future in ways they never would again. Soon, according to every magazine, we were going to have underwater cities off every coast, space colonies inside giant spheres of glass, atomic trains and airlines, personal jetpacks, a gyrocopter in every driveway, cars that turned into boats or even submarines, moving sidewalks to whisk us effortlessly to school and offices, domed-roofed automobiles that drove themselves along sleek highways, allowing Mom, Dad, and the 2 boys to play a board game or wave to a neighbor in a passing gyrocopter, or just sit back and enjoy saying some of those splendid words that existed in the 50s and are no longer heard. Mimeograph, rotisserie, stenographer, icebox, dime store, rutabaga, Studebaker, panty raid, bobby socks, Sputnik, beatnik, canasta, Cinerama, Moose Lodge, Daddy-O. For those who couldn't wait for underwater cities and self-driving cars, thousands of smaller enrichments were available right now. If you were to avail yourself of all that was on offer from advertisers in a single issue of, let's say, Popular Science from, let's say, December 1956, you could, among much else, teach yourself ventriloquism, learn to cut meat by correspondence or in person at the National School of Meat Cutting in Toledo, Ohio, embark on a lucrative career sharpening skates door to door, arrange to sell fire extinguishers from home, and rupture troubles once and for all, build radios, repair radios, perform on radio, talk on radio to people in different countries and possibly on different planets. Improve your personality, get a personality, acquire a manly physique, learn to dance, create personalized stationery for profit, or make big bucks in your spare time at home building lawn figures and other novelty ornaments. My brother, who was normally quite an intelligent human being, once invested in a booklet that promised to teach him how to throw his voice. He would say something unintelligible through rigid lips, then quickly step aside and say, "That sounded like it came from over there, didn't it?" He also saw an ad in Mechanics Illustrated that invited him to enjoy color television at home for 65 cents plus postage, placed an order, and 4 weeks later received in the mail a multicolored sheet of transparent plastic that he was instructed to tape over the television screen and watch the image through. Having spent the money, my brother refused to accept that it was a touch disappointing. When a human face moved into the pinkish part of the screen or a section of lawn briefly coincided with the green portion, he would leap up in triumph. Look, that's what color television is going to look like," he would say. "This is all just experimental, you know." In fact, color television didn't come to our neighborhood until nearly the end of the decade, when Mr. Kiesler on St. John's Road bought an enormous RCA Victor Consulette, the flagship of the RCA fleet, for a lot of money. For at least 2 years, his was the only known color television in private ownership, which made it a fantastic novelty. On Saturday evenings, the children of the neighborhood would steal into his yard and stand in his flower beds to watch a program called My Living Doll through the double window behind his sofa. I am pretty certain that Mr. Kiesler didn't realize that 24 children of various ages and sizes were silently watching the TV with him, or he wouldn't have played with himself quite so enthusiastically every time the nubile Julie Newmar bounded onto the screen. I assumed it was some sort of isometrics. Apart from the birth of the Thunderbolt Kid, 1951 was not a hugely eventful year in America. Harper's Magazine in December struck a somber economic note with an article by Nancy B. Mavity on an unsettling new phenomenon, the two-income family, in which husband and wife both went out to work to pay for a more ambitious lifestyle. Mavity's worry was not how women would cope with the demands of employment on top of child rearing and housework, but rather what this would do to the man's traditional standing as breadwinner. "I'd be ashamed to let my wife work," one man told Mavity tartly, and it was clear from her tone that Mavity expected most readers to agree. Remarkably, until the war, many women in America had been unable to work, whether they wanted to or not. Up until Pearl Harbor, half the 48 states had laws making it illegal to employ a married woman. In this respect, my father was commendably, I would even say enthusiastically, liberal, for there was nothing about my mother's earning capacity that did not gladden his heart. She worked for the Des Moines Register as the home furnishings editor, in which capacity she provided calm reassurance to 2 generations of homemakers who were anxious to know whether the time had come for paisley in the bedroom, whether they should have square sofa cushions or round, or whether their house itself passed muster. "The one-story ranch is here to stay," she assured her readers, to presumed cries of relief in the western suburbs, in her last piece before disappearing to have me. The only downside of my mother's working was that it put a little pressure on her with regard to running the home, and particularly with regard to dinner, which frankly was not her strong suit anyway. My mother always ran late and was dangerously forgetful into the bargain. You soon learned to stand aside about 10 to 6 every evening, for it was then that she would fly in the back door, throw something in the oven, and disappear into some other quarter of the house to embark on the 1,000 other household tasks that greeted her each evening. In consequence, she nearly always forgot about dinner until a point slightly beyond way too late. As a rule, you knew it was time to eat when you could hear potatoes exploding in the oven. We didn't call it the kitchen in our house. We called it the burns unit. "It's a bit burned," my mother would say apologetically at every meal, presenting you with a piece of meat that looked like something, a much-loved pet perhaps, salvaged from a tragic house fire. "But I think I scraped off most of the burned part," she would add, overlooking that this included every bit of it that had once been flesh. Happily, this all suited my father. His palate only responded to two tastes, burned and ice cream. So everything suited him so long as it was sufficiently dark and not too startlingly flavorful. Theirs truly was a marriage made in heaven, for no one could burn food like my mother or eat it like my dad. As part of her job, my mother bought stacks of housekeeping magazines. House Beautiful, House and Garden, Better Homes and Garden, Good Housekeeping. And I read these with a certain avidity, partly because they were always lying around. And in our house, all idle moments were spent reading something, and partly because they depicted lives so absorbingly at variance with our own. The housewives in my mother's magazines were so collected, so organized, so calmly on top of things, and their food was perfect. Their lives were perfect. They dressed up to take their food out of the oven. There were no black circles on the ceiling above their stoves, no mutating goo climbing over the sides of their forgotten saucepans. Children didn't have to be ordered to stand back every time they opened their oven doors. And their foods, baked Alaska, lobster Newburgh, chicken cacciatore, why, these were dishes that we didn't even dream of, much less encounter in Iowa. Like most people in Iowa in the 1950s, we were more cautious eaters in our house. On the rare occasions when we were presented with food with which we were not comfortable or familiar, on planes or trains, or when invited to a meal cooked by someone who was not herself from Iowa, we tended to tilt it up carefully with a knife and examine it from every angle as if determining whether it might need to be diffused. Once on a trip to San Francisco, my father was taken by friends to a Chinese restaurant, and he described it to us afterward in the somber tones of someone recounting a near-death experience. "And they ate it with sticks, you know," he said knowledgeably. "Goodness," said my mother. "I would rather have gas gangrene than go through that again," my father added grimly. In our house, we did not eat pasta, rice, cream cheese, sour cream, garlic, mayonnaise, onions, corned beef, pastrami, salami, or any food of any type, any foreign food of any type except French toast. Bread that wasn't white and at least 65% air. Spices other than salt, pepper, and maple syrup. Fish that was any shape other than rectangular and not coated in bright orange breadcrumbs. And then only on Fridays, and only when my mother remembered it was Friday, which in fact was not often. Soups not blessed by Campbell's, and only a very few of these. Anything with dubious regional names like pone or gumbo, or foods that had at any time been an esteemed staple of slaves or peasants. All other types of foods, curries, enchiladas, tofu, bagels, sushi, couscous, yogurt, kale, arugula, Parma ham, any cheese that was not a vivid, bright yellow and shiny enough to see your reflection in, had either not yet been invented or it was as yet unknown to us. We really were radiantly unsophisticated. I remember being surprised to learn at quite an advanced age that a shrimp cocktail was not, as I had always imagined, a pre-dinner alcoholic drink with a shrimp in it. All our meals consisted of leftovers. My mother had a seemingly inexhaustible supply of foods that had already been to the table, sometimes repeatedly. Apart from a few perishable dairy products, everything in the fridge was older than I was, sometimes by many years. Her oldest food possession of all, it more or less goes without saying, was a fruitcake that was kept in a metal tin and dated from the colonial period. I can only assume that my mother did all her cooking in the 1940s, so that she could spend the rest of her life surprising herself with what she could find under cover in the back of the fridge. I never knew her to reject a food. The rule of thumb seemed to be that if you opened the lid and the stuff inside didn't make you actually recoil and take at least one staggered step backward, it was deemed okay to eat. Both my parents had grown up during the Great Depression, and neither of them ever threw anything away if they could possibly avoid it. My mother routinely washed and dried paper plates, smoothed out for reuse spare aluminum foil. If you left a pea on your plate, it became part of a future meal. All our sugar came in little packets, spirited out of restaurants in deep coat pockets, as did our jams, jellies, crackers, oyster, and saltine. Tartar sauces, some of our ketchup and butter, and all of our napkins, and a very occasional ashtray. Anything that came with a restaurant table, really. One of the happiest moments in my parents' life was when maple syrup started to be served in small disposable packets, and they could add those to the household hoard. Under the sink, my mother kept an enormous collection of jars, including one known as the toity jar. In our house, this was the term for a pea, and throughout my early years, the toity jar was called into service whenever a need to leave the house inconveniently coincided with a sudden need by someone, and when I say someone, I mean, of course, the youngest child, me, to pee. "Oh, you'll just have to go in the toity jar then," my mother would say, with just a hint of exasperation and a worried glance at the kitchen clock. It took me a long time to realize that the toady jar was not always, or even often, the same jar twice. Insofar as I thought about it at all, I suppose I guessed that the toady jar was routinely discarded and replaced with a fresh jar. We had hundreds of them, after all. So you may imagine my consternation, succeeded by varying degrees of dismay, when I went to the fridge one evening for a second helping of halved peaches and realized that we were all eating from a jar that had, only days before, held my urine. I recognized the jar at once because it had a Z-shaped strip of label adhering to it that uncannily recalled the mark of Zorro, a fact that I had cheerfully remarked upon as soon as I had filled the jar with my precious bodily nectars. Now here it was, holding our dessert peaches. I couldn't have been more surprised if I had just been handed a packet of photos showing my mother in flagrante with, let's say, the guys at the local gas station. "Mom," I said, coming to the dining room doorway and holding up my find. "Is this the toity jar?" "Oh, no, honey," she replied smoothly without looking up. "The toity jar is a special jar." "What's the toity jar?" asked my father with an amused air, spooning a peach into his mouth. "It's the jar I toity in," I explained, "and this is it." "Billy toities in a jar?" said my father, with very slight difficulty, as he was no longer eating the peach half he had just taken in, but resting it on his tongue, pending receipt of further information concerning its recent history. "Just occasionally," my mother said. My father's mystification was now nearly total, but his mouth was so full of unswallowed peach juice that he could not meaningfully speak. He asked, I believe, why I didn't go upstairs to the bathroom like a normal person. It was a fair question under the circumstances. "Well, sometimes we're in a hurry," my mother went on, a touch uncomfortably, "so I keep a jar under the sink, a special jar." I reappeared from the fridge, cradling more jars, as many as I could carry. "I'm pretty sure I've used all of these too," I announced. "That can't be right," my mother said, but there was a kind of question mark hanging off the edge of it. Then she added, perhaps a touch self-destructively, "Anyway, I always rinse all the jars thoroughly before reuse." My father rose and walked to the kitchen, inclined over the waste bin, and allowed the peach half to fall into it, along with about half a liter of goo. Perhaps the toity jar's not such a good idea," he suggested. The end. Thank you for listening.